Alex Barth for our live Q&A edition of the Patriots Beat podcast. And Alex, we wanted to start with the news of the day. Russell Wilson kind of requesting a trade from Seattle, not really requesting a trade from Seattle, basically saying that he would be open to a trade to the Cowboys, Saints, Raiders, or Bears. Notice no Patriots on that list, no AFC East teams at all on that list. I think what we can do in this part of the show is lament on the fact that the Patriots are not interesting for any of these quarterbacks right now. Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson, any of these prizes of what could potentially be prizes, I should say, of the offseason do not have New England currently on their list.
Well, I also want to talk about, and I respect the hell out of The Athletic. They do great journalism. But I think a lot of the reason this story got off the rails is because of the wording of the headline in the tweet, right? Which said Russell Wilson's team broached a trade with the Seahawks. And I like, did you have to Google broached? I had to Google broached. And then I looked up the history of the word, and it really hasn't been used since like the 1830s. But broached, here's the definition: to raise a sensitive or difficult subject for discussion, or to package. So basically what happened was the Seahawks basically, or Russell Wilson's camp basically gave the Seahawks the teams Russell Wilson would be traded to unprompted. Now that became public, which makes it a whole thing. I don't know necessarily if it works this way in football. I know in hockey, this is something teams do all the time. At the start of every season, and usually, again, right before the trade deadline, they go through every player on their roster with the no-trade clause and get that team's list of which teams they can be traded to. It's just kind of what you do. It's just standard operating procedure. I don't know if they do that in the NFL, but just Russell Wilson's camp saying, here's the teams we'd accept a trade to, it's not nothing, but it's not him demanding a trade either. It's very far from that.
Right. And the reporting in The Athletic, which again was really well thought out, really thorough, was about the dysfunction and sort of the unhappiness that Russell Wilson has with the Seattle Seahawks organization. That's not to say that they're going to trade Russell Wilson or Russell Wilson's requesting a trade, like you said, Alex, but he is unhappy with the state of the Seahawks currently. And I think the biggest thing is that he feels as though Pete Carroll answers to nobody in that organization, gets away with a lot of things, and there's really no repercussions for the poor coaching, the poor team management that they've, kind of experienced over the last couple of years. And I think what's weird to me, and maybe this is not the greatest of times to be talking about this from a Bill Belichick perspective, because his management of the team in the last couple of years has certainly not been great, but his management of the Patriots for the last 20 years has been fantastic, right? And you look at the whole kind of big picture of this, and you kind of think to yourself, do you really want to go to a team like the Chicago Bears? What have the Bears done lately?
Why are they on that list?
Right.
Like, I tried to find the connection. He's from Ohio.
Right.
So that's near Illinois, maybe. I don't know. Like, I looked it up. His wife, I thought maybe his wife's from Chicago. She's from Texas. I could not find the Chicago link at all.
I don't know what the Chicago link is, other than maybe he likes.
He likes orange.
He likes the city of Chicago. I don't know.
Not a bad city,
but it's not a bad city. I just think that's what's peculiar to me is some of these teams on the Jets, for instance, they got some cap space. They got a new regime in there, but is that an appealing team to go play for other than the fact that it's in New York? What's the appeal there? They have a roster that is multiple pieces away from being contenders, true contenders. Maybe they could be playoff team with a Deshaun Watson at quarterback, but are they a real Super Bowl contender just by adding Deshaun Watson onto that roster? They got holes all up and down the team. So,
well, again, this goes back to the fact that this is not an immediate request. Maybe he's looking at the Jets and they're sitting there with the second overall pick and they have a ton of cap space, and he's thinking in a year or two, that's a spot, something like that. Right. So again, the Jets make a ton of sense right now, but this isn't for right now. Again, that's just what I will stress, is because of the way this whole offseason has gone. Look, I'd love to see him get traded. The Cowboys were on the list. I'd love to see him get traded to the Cowboys because then Dak comes here. But right. The way this whole offseason's gone, where there's smoke, there's fire kind of thing. But I think this was just, something leaked by his camp to push the Seahawks a little bit, to make some more aggressive moves this offseason. I don't think he's going anywhere. Like, we don't even know at this point if Deshaun Watson's going anywhere. They're reporting that the Texans are still hanging up the phone when people call about him. So I put and I have been through the roof with the Dak Prescott stuff. So I'm not opposed to the insane, but I put no stock in Russell Wilson going anywhere this offseason.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I just think it's interesting because, look, I get the Patriots on paper don't have the weapons necessarily that would attract the quarterback, don't necessarily have the recent history, I should say, of how things ended with Tom Brady. Doesn't look exactly great if you're a quarterback coming in. But I just feel like Bill Belichick has proven with Brady that he is going to give you the pieces and give you the foundation to be a Super Bowl team almost right away. And there's the little things that Bill Belichick does as a team manager that I think other teams don't necessarily do. One of the conversations that Russell Wilson's had with the Seahawks is how poor the pass protection has been for him there in Seattle. That's one thing we know Bill Belichick is going to do for a quarterback. He's going to keep you clean, right? He's going to find a way to protect you if you're a QB. If you actually look at actual team building and just actual things that matter for wins and losses, not the fantasy football points, not, who's your DK Metcalf, not that stuff. The stuff that actually wins football games, complementary football, all three phases, pass protection and offensive line play. The Patriots have always been at the top of the list in all of those types of departments. And if I'm a player, if I'm a quarterback, I think that they should definitely take it a little bit more seriously as a destination than what we're currently seeing. Again, if you have questions, I see some trickling in already. Please drop them in the chat. We're going to
Let's try to go. It is supposed to be defense week. We did the quarterbacks ad nauseum last week in offense. We'll take anything, but we're trying to do defense week. I'll throw that out there.
We are trying to do defense week. It's not going very well so far in this.
We got half the show on Tuesday.
That's true. No. On Tuesday we did well, and these questions that we're getting right now, not so well.
Well, they didn't know. Maybe they didn't know it was defense week.
Okay, fair enough. So I want to pull up this question first here. This one's about Justin Fields, but we can kind of make it. Yeah. This one's about Justin Fields, but we can kind of make this. Mel Kiper released his mock draft today. It's just a mock draft, guys. It's not anything set in stone. Mel Kiper hits on maybe 10% of the time on his picks in his mock drafts anyway. But he did have the Patriots trading up to draft Trey Lance. And obviously this question's about Justin Fields and how far he would have to drop in order for the Patriots to entertain trading up. But I just think the question of trading up in general, we've talked about it a little bit, but how much stock do we put into the fact that maybe the Patriots could trade? Do we see it as a real possibility that New England could actually trade up for a quarterback this year?
Well, I'm a broken record for the last 3 weeks. I go back to that Mike Reese report about uncharacteristically aggressive. And if that's really the plan, then yeah, I believe they could do it. I think you need to go into the top 8 to get one of the top 4 quarterbacks. Like Kiper's was a mess, his mock. I actually wrote about how much of a mess it was this morning. You can find that on 98.5thesportshub.com. But you probably need to get into the top 8 to get one of the top 4 quarterbacks. Mac Jones might be in play at 15. But again, if we're buying that aggressive report, which I've been back and forth on, and it's nothing, I believe Mike Reese all the way, but we've kind of talked about how aggressive can mean different things. If they're truly, by definition of the word, going to be aggressive, I put a ton of stock in them trading up. If it's just any other year, no, they probably don't. I don't think they trade down. There's going to be a lot of talent on the board at 15. Everybody talks about how they trade down every year. They do it about half the time, and they generally do it in weaker drafts or when they have, when their picks are structured differently. This wouldn't be a textbook year for them to trade down. So I think they ultimately stay at 15, but if we're going to buy that aggressive report, then yeah, I think there is a case for them to get in the top 8, because I think you're going to see 3 quarterbacks go in the top 4. I don't see Trey Lance going past 8. I think he's a fantastic fit for the Panthers. They're in a perfect spot to draft him with one more year on Teddy Bridgewater's contract. That's it to me. Beyond that point, you're talking about Mac Jones, and you're talking about Kyle Trask. But yeah, I you know what? If they're going to be aggressive, I buy it.
Yeah, listen, I've been pounding the table for Trey Lance. I know this question's about Justin Fields. I like him as a quarterback prospect too. I just feel like we're talking about all these players and Deshaun Watson, Dan Graziano of ESPN just tweeted that Deshaun Watson again doubled down on wanting to get traded by the Houston Texans. And you look at Watson's list, you look at Russell Wilson's list, none of these lists include the Patriots, right? And the way to get the quarterback, the franchise QB of the future, is to get him in the draft. It's the easiest way to do it. It's the really the most direct path to do it for New England at this point, because of these star quarterbacks just don't seem to want to come here. So that's the path, right? Is to trade up for one of these guys, whoever you like. I think the Patriots are really going to like Trey Lance. I think that he's the type of quarterback that can play in the quick game. He can run some of the RPO and read option packages that they ran with Cam and keep those in the offense. He can do some of the things that Brady did, spread the field, get the ball out quickly, but then he also adds that element of the deep ball and the downfield passing and the athleticism and the ability to create outside the pocket. He, I think, fits the Patriots schematically a lot more than maybe you would think on the surface, because you think of a running quarterback, and someone like that is not typically Brady 1, 2, 3 and out, right? But Trey Lance does a lot more of that than I think people realize and recognize, because a lot of his highlights that circulate around the interwebs are him scrambling out of the pocket, running 3 people over and throwing a 60-yard bomb, right? Those are the highlights that make Twitter. But I'm telling you, he can do a lot more of the little things well than I think that people want to give him credit for in this draft. So I really like Trey Lance that they're going to trade up. I also want to touch on this question here about this Deshaun Watson stuff. And then we're going to try to get into some non-quarterback stuff. So I just mentioned it, that Dan Graziano said that the Texans brass and new coach David Culley met with Deshaun Watson, and Deshaun Watson reiterated to Houston that he wants to get traded. I'm not so interested in the fact that Deshaun Watson wants to get traded, because I don't think he's going to get traded here. But there is a domino effect that could happen that could benefit the Patriots, right? If one of those teams like the Jets ends up trading for Deshaun Watson, well, that's one less quarterback team potentially. If a team like San Francisco ends up trading for Deshaun Watson, then maybe you can get Jimmy G here. Those are sort of the scenarios that I think that you have to look at if you're New England, not necessarily Deshaun Watson himself, but that domino effect, that second move that's going to come as a result of that.
Yeah, and from a Patriots point of view, I think you're looking solely at San Francisco in terms of those teams. Maybe he comes in the division, although I think the latest list was like San Francisco and Denver. Were his top 2. So, I mean, talk about me being torn, right, between my guy out in Denver and Drew Lock and Jimmy Garoppolo, who's the last guy I want here. But, you look at kind of wherever he goes, and look, I think Drew Lock is good. I do. Would I give up a chance to get Deshaun Watson just because of him? No. So, I think there is a way where that trickle down can end up being a good thing for the Patriots from Deshaun Watson, but unless he goes to Denver, or I've heard Cleveland thrown out there as like a big stretch.
Carolina, I think, is another team that
I don't know if Teddy Bridgewater's on a 1-year deal. It's a very similar deal to Marcus Mariota. I think at that point you just go back to Mariota, right? I think the trickle down more likely than not leaves the Patriots settling than upgrading.
Yeah, I think the question is what does Houston do with that pick that they acquire for Deshaun Watson if he does get moved?
Oh, it
right?
has to be a quarterback. If
it's a quarterback, then this really doesn't benefit the Patriots a whole lot unless it's San Francisco that gets Deshaun Watson, right?
And even that benefit is an interesting term. I wouldn't phrase it like that.
You know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I do, yes.
It doesn't impact the Patriots. I'll use that word instead of benefit. It doesn't impact the Patriots unless it ends up being San Francisco. The Jets, a lot of people have floated out Sam Darnold. I just don't see the Jets trading Sam Darnold in the division just to watch Bill Belichick turn him into something. That doesn't sound like the best interest of the team for the Jets would not be to move Darnold within the division. Same with Miami and Tua. If the Texans don't want Tua in the trade for some reason, I don't see why Miami would part and trade him to New England. That doesn't make much sense. So really it's the Niners and Jimmy G, or maybe the Texans surprise everybody and don't take a quarterback with the pick that they get back. I don't think that's going to happen, but you got to float that possibility out there. Let's move up to quarterbacks.
You want to do some defense?
Yeah, this is a good question. Do you see any defensive opt-outs? He said getting traded, Daniel. I maybe cut, maybe restructured. I mean, all the types of possibilities out there. I want to focus mainly on Dante Hightower, who is due $12 million this season against the salary cap. Certainly the Patriots would like to lower that number a little bit, right? And the question is do you want to sign Hightower to an extension? Do you want to sign he's not going to take a straight pay cut I don't think that's
right.
Why would Hightower agree to that? So I think the question is what kind of extension are you willing to do for a linebacker who's 31 years old and hasn't always been a guy, he has had some injuries in his past.
Yeah, I think maybe 1 year, right? You spread the money out. I wouldn't look much beyond that. He also might want to retire. He may know this is his last season and he won't take an extension. So that's going to be tricky, but I think they'll figure out a way to get him back. I think Chung is back for sure. When I look at, the opt-outs maybe being moved, I'm looking at the offensive side of the ball. Like, is Matt LaCosse going to be a roster lock? Probably not. What happens with Marcus Cannon? They have some good young tackles. If he's taking a step back, is he a guy who could be a cap casualty? How does Danny Vitale fit in the picture with them drafting Dalton Keene? So I think defensively is where they were. And I apologize if I'm missing anybody, but the big ones were Hightower, Chung, on the defensive side of the ball, right?
Yes, Hightower and Chung. Really, the rest of them were offense.
Right. I feel like there's a third. I don't know who it would be.
I don't think there was, unless we're both playing.
I might be thinking of like Brandon Bolden defensively, just because special teams. But I think that conversation is more on the offensive side of the ball. They really missed Hightower and Chung last year, especially Hightower. They don't have Hightower's replacement in the room yet. Maybe that gets solved during the draft. But even if it does, when they brought Hightower in, right, they did it to replace Gerard Mayo, and they made sure those guys had a year, 2 years together. I think you're going to see something similar here. So I think on the defensive side of the ball, you're going to see those opt-outs come back.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, Hightower has basically made it clear that he wants to come back. Patrick Chung has said publicly that he is coming back. So yes. Patrick Chung will be back. That contract's interesting too, but they just signed him to that extension. It's really hard to kind of rework Patrick Chung's deal at this point. So they're kind of stuck with him at that number. I don't know if they're necessarily thrilled about that in hindsight, especially with the way that Kyle Duggar ended up playing last year. That's an interesting player as well. I don't even think they can cut him due to the dead money on the deal is really not going to save him much in the cap anyways. So that's an interesting one. Hightower, I remember I got into some arguments on Twitter about his cap number. You don't want to upset him too much because when you look at the linebacker play that they had last year and how much upgrade he is over guys like Terez Hall and Juwan Bentley, and he's such a big upgrade that you definitely want to keep him in the building. But I think an extension, Miguel Benzon, Pat's cap, he's thrown out like a 3 or 4 year extension with some dummy years, maybe tacked on there, years without guaranteed money so you can get out of it after a year or two. That just spaces out the cap hits. I think that's a good way to go about it. Let's go to the draft. Any D-line prospects in the first few rounds that we like? I've been watching a bunch of D-line guys the last couple of days. I want to throw out a couple of names. We talked about Marvin Wilson a lot on the podcast on Tuesday. We both really like him. The guy that I just can't get over how much I really like him is Tyler Shelvin from LSU. And that is just your prototypical 3-4 nose tackle. Just the guy that's going to sit in the A gaps, clog up double teams, 2 gap at the point of attack, reset the line of scrimmage, heavy hands, 360 pounds, big guy. That's the type of player that I think that they could be interested on day 2. There are some other guys like Jay Tufuolo from USC, who's more of like a 3-4N type prospect that could be interesting. But is there anybody else that we haven't talked about that you like?
So I don't know. I mean, he's kind of hybrid D-line linebacker. Like he's sort of in that John Simon category. I really like Jalen Phillips from Miami.
Love Jalen Phillips.
15's probably too high. 47 he's probably off the board. But if they trade back into the first round, earlier the second, he's just a supreme athlete. He's fast. He's quick. He's strong. He's flexible. He doesn't quite have the same body as Chandler Jones, but there's some Chandler Jones to his game where just he can win physically. The technique is there, but it's his best trait is just his physical toolbox. And they tend to do very well with those guys as pass rushers. Jamie Collins is another one. Again, more of a traditional linebacker than Phillips. Not a perfect comparison, but they can get a lot out of those kind of guys. So I look at Jalen Phillips. He's kind of, again, in that odd spot between you definitely don't take him at 15. You're probably not going to get him at 47. Is there a way they can figure out a trade to put him in play? Probably. But if that happens, he's a guy, they trade back into the first round, I would love to see them somehow end up with.
Yeah, he's got great tape. Now he's got a big injury history, and that's what's going to end up knocking him down the board. If he didn't have those injuries, then he's probably an end of a first round type of pick. He had an ankle, he had a wrist, he had a concussion. He had a freak accident where he fell off a 4-wheeler and got a concussion and hurt himself pretty badly. And those types of things you kind of write off as like, okay, you made a mistake and you turned too quickly on a four-wheeler and you end up spilling over, whatever. That's not a football injury, right? So maybe there's a little bit of kind of overblown narratives about his health problems, but he's
Richard LeCounte kind of thing.
Yeah, he has had a lot of concerns with his health, but on tape, a really long and a really explosive prospect. And those are the types of things that you look for, especially with edge players. Does he have the length to kind of soften the edge and be able to extend his arms and turn the corner? And does he have that first step explosiveness to threaten tackles around the corner as well? Jaelan Phillips checks all those boxes. I think if he was a healthy player, if he didn't have that injury history, he would be my second edge in the draft behind Kwity Paye. But he just, that's the risk that you take. So it's definitely a player I probably would stay away from in the first round. But I agree with you 100% that if they can find a way to get him at the beginning of the second round, or maybe they trade back and accumulate picks or something like that, and he's a guy that I would definitely have on my radar. Let's look at needs overall, just on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah.
I think that this is a surprising one that CB is even in this conversation. Is probably be more like linebacker and defensive line. But I guess, how do you kind of grade or rate the needs on the defensive side of the ball? Linebacker is number one for me, but I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, linebacker's up there. I think the reason cornerback's in there is because, long term it's a question mark. And part of the reason the Patriots have been so good at corner for the last 3 years is they've been a year ahead. They've planned a year ahead. They've gotten all of that done. So you kind of want to stay ahead of the curve because it's starting to catch up to them, especially if they trade Stephon Gilmore, right? So it's a need in terms of them wanting to kind of keep the success they've had. And you look at it, if corner falls apart and you don't fix the linebacker situation, then your defense is just a total mess. So yeah, I see some people saying they trust Belichick more with the defensive backs and just get that set and make sure you're good there and then see what fits at linebacker. You already have some promising young pieces, which the Patriots might not necessarily have at corner. J.C. Jackson's there. Jonathan Jones isn't quite like young anymore. I think we know what he is, right? I think he's more or less at his ceiling. So, but I still go linebacker. I think we saw what happened last year, and having somebody in that Donta Hightower role is so important. And I've said that before. I'd love to get the next guy in place before Hightower, whether he retires or just leaves or whatever, like go get that guy, whoever it is, whether it's free agency or the draft. So I'm going to go linebacker on this one, but I don't think cornerback is totally off the grid on that one. I don't know if you want to do, somebody brought up Jerrell Casey, and that's kind of a news of the day thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one more point about the linebackers. The old football cliche with linebackers is that your defense is as fast as your Mike, right? Whoever's playing Mike linebacker, that's usually the heartbeat of your defense, and that's the guy that covers sideline to sideline, that drops into zones, that does things like that, that if your Mike linebacker, like last year with Juwan Bentley, is slow, then your entire front seven is usually a slow-flowing front seven. So I think for the Patriots, getting a guy like a Zaven Collins or getting a guy like a Micah Parsons who can step into that linebacker role and bring some real heat to that second level of the defense is something that they desperately need. And Kyle Duggar did a little bit. Kyle Duggar brought that just a tad, but he's going to bring it more as that star weak side linebacker type of player, not necessarily the guy that's going to take on people in the trenches. So I just really would like to see them go ahead and get somebody that can really flow aside, even if it's like a guy like Nick Bolton, right? Who's not necessarily a first round lock, but even if it's someone on day two, I think that that's a big spot that they really need to fill, because people talk about the speed of the Patriots defense. The Patriots defense is not fast enough. It's because they're not fast enough at the second level. That's really where the issue has been for them. We can talk about
before we go to Casey, because somebody brought this up too with the corners. Jeff brought up getting Dev McCourty's replacement. I would argue safety is a bigger need than corner. Kind of like I talked about with Hightower. That's such a crucial role what Devin does, and he has probably 1 or 2 years left. They don't even have like his backup. Forget the next guy. Like when they traded Deron Harmon, and they love to use those two center field deep safeties. They never really replaced Deron Harmon last year. I'd love to see them go get another deep safety, a guy who can play alongside Devin and maybe eventually replace him.
100%.
Right, let's do Jerrell Casey.
Yeah, last year they really mixed and matched with Jason McCourty and Jonathan Jones in that role, and that was obviously not ideal for either one of those guys. So I'm with you 100%. Jerrell Casey, certainly a really good player back in his prime, let's call it.
Yeah.
These are the types of players I think the Patriots would have gone after if Brady was still here. those guys toward at the end of their careers that are chasing rings that, you can get at a discount because they're sort of over the hill a little bit. I think Jerrell Casey used to be a really great player, would be a system fit, just from the traditional kind of checking those boxes of power at the point of attack and hand usage and leverage and stuff like that. But I'm not sure if the Patriots are really interested in that level of player at this time. They probably want to get guys more closer to their prime of their careers.
Yeah, and I just don't know. If you want to go free agency of Shelby Harris, who's a better long-term option at the position, probably similar money. It's a great draft for defensive tackles as well. Like you said, if you're trying to put together, round off the edges of a year-to-year roster when you're going under Brady, it makes a ton of sense. But what does 1 year of Jerrell Casey really get you at this point? You want to look at the 3, 4, 5 year projection, and that's just not what he fits into right now.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. Here's another name in the first round that we don't talk about a lot. I will agree with that. We're going to call him Joke on this podcast because I'm just not going to try to say his name. But Joke is an interesting player because he's, to me, basically Kyle Duggar in a different form, right? He is a box player, but he's also a slot defender. He's your 2021, I guess I should say, safety, right? He's really a box safety that's playing now more like a hybrid linebacker role. I just think that they have enough bodies at that type of position, right? You have Kyle Duggar, Patrick Chung's coming back, Adrian Phillips is still under contract, Juwan Williams is like trying to get into that role a little bit as a tight end stopper. He's a great player. He plays extremely fast, extremely physical, smart guy, can really cover and has that kind of so much explosiveness in his game that even though he's not the biggest of guys, he can really lay the wood if he gets a running start because he is so fast. But I just don't, they have so many of those guys already. I think adding another one of those guys it's going to convolute things. It's going to really be confusing of how do you get all of these guys on the field at once?
Sure. I know it's, we always talk about take the best player available, but there has to be some sort of constraints to that. And I actually want to ask you this because you mentioned this on Tuesday and I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not like being a smart ass here. Like I'm legitimately asking you this. You mentioned that the Patriots do put a stock on guys who can come right in and contribute as a rookie. And that's true. And I agree with that. And I think that's important. I guess the question is, how do you square that with draft the best player available? Because a guy, right, like Jock, there's no role for him as a rookie because there are so many of these players.
Right.
So he might be the best player on the board, but where does he fit in the context of the roster? So I guess it's how do you want to balance that? I just don't know that even if he is the most talented player on the board of 15, which I don't think he will be, but even if he is the most talented player on the board of 15, or if they trade back to 25, say, and he's the best player on the board there, much more realistic. I just don't know how you square that. When you have a roster that has immediate needs and there are guys who are close to, if not equally talented, who can fit right away, how you justify that pick other than saying like, oh, yeah, the highest Madden rating, essentially. Like, I can't get that one to sit right. As good of a player as he is, it doesn't seem like an easily justifiable pick.
It's not. And that's, I think the biggest thing with the Patriots is Bill Belichick, and hopefully we'll talk to him before the draft, and he's going to go on some soliloquy about how the Patriots don't draft based on need, right? They draft the best player available, the most talented guy, and I think there is some truth to that, but I think that what they do is they make sure that within 1 to 2 years of drafting that player, especially if they're going to take that guy in the first round, that there's a way for him to get on the football field, right? You're not going to draft, if you're the Patriots, you're not going to draft a corner knowing you're keeping Stephon Gilmore and J.C. Jackson, drafting Patrick Surtain in the first round with those two guys already rostered. Where does he play? Right? How do you get them all three of those guys on the field at once? I think that there is some value that they do place in need in terms of how do we get this guy on the field? Where does he fit within the puzzle pieces of the defense or the offense? And Joke is one of those players that is extremely talented, certainly a top 20 guy in this draft, but just there isn't a place for him to play. And I just don't know how you can justify that, especially with a team that has so many holes, how you can justify taking him there, even if he is the best, highest rated player on your board, then trade down, trade down and go pick somebody else.
So I guess you have to square when you say best player available, if best player means most valuable, maybe, potential role, potential 3-year outlook, that's factored into the value. And maybe they value him lower than other teams do, just because there's no spot for him. Somebody did best safety fit. if you want to jump into that in the draft, because I actually think that relates to this. I think the best safety fit for them, I mean, outside of the guys who are going to be, off the board, I really like Paris Ford for them from Pittsburgh. The problem is it's the same thing. Paris Ford is just Kyle Duggar who went to a D1 school.
Right.
So I just think that's interesting because there's a lot of good. Somebody brought up Mooring, the safety from TCU, who I think is kind of similar there. This is a really good box safety draft. It's not as good of a deep safety draft, which is funny because they took Kyle Duggar last year. There's a lot of fits in terms of scheme, but maybe not in terms of their place on the roster. If you're looking at guys for place on the roster, I really like Richard LeCounte from Georgia, who's a classic pick for them. This time last year was considered the best safety in this draft, was a consensus first-round pick. And then he goes and he got in a kind of like we talked about before with who we talking, Jalen Phillips. Yeah. He gets in a dirt bike accident on Halloween this past season, misses the rest of the year. He only played 5 games, and there's no indication that he was at fault. He was turning into a gas station. Another car turned in at the same time, actually hit his bike into traffic where he was hit by another car. They said the fact he was wearing a helmet saved his life. So, wear your helmets. But, everything you read about this guy coming out of Georgia, multi-time team captain, just fantastic leader, total workhorse in the film at practice, also in the film, just a smart guy, loves football, isn't just a good leader, but enjoys being a leader. And that's something we're seeing become a lot more important in today's NFL. Not just can you lead, but do you enjoy having a leadership role? So again, it checks a lot of the boxes. And on top of that, very instinctive, smart player, deep safety, not the best athlete, but he's quick. Right, he's going to be able to patrol the back end. Probably you can't necessarily put him center field, but if you have 2 deep safeties, he can take half the field. Was a consensus first-round pick a year ago. Now he's considered a day 3 pick, basically just because of the motorcycle accident. You're still getting the same player. He didn't have a bad season. So I look at that guy, and I think that's, and Georgia too. They have a couple Georgia guys on the roster.
Yeah.
That, to me, is a guy who I think, in terms of fit, in terms of what would they do, I can't help but connect him to the Patriots. Richard LeCounte.
I haven't done deep dives into safeties yet. I don't love the safety draft this year. I don't love it in terms of what they're looking for, because you mentioned, there's a couple of guys I think could be good box guys, certainly good guys closer to the line of scrimmage. But in terms of those deep center field safeties, not so much. But there is one scenario that somebody just threw out here in the chat. 2 guys, that I think are really interesting. I want to talk about Malik Hooker, though, because this is a guy that is a failed first-round pick, right? Typical Belichick, right? A guy that was extremely talented. And Malik Hooker, for all of his issues with injuries and stuff like that, is an elite deep safety, elite center fielder, somebody that can really be a playmaker on the back end of your defense when he's healthy. To me, these are the types of chances that the Patriots should be interested in, right? Are the guys that were failed first-rounders. You kind of take a bet on the upside, hope that you can keep him healthy, because if you can with Malik Hooker, he has those Devin McCourty-like deep safety skills and maybe even better ball production when he's really on his game as well. So I really love this idea for the Patriots if they can get Malik Hooker here.
So I guess I'll take Trey Boston then. First off, the speed at which I would buy a Patriots jersey that says Boston on the back. Let him wear 3 digits, 617. It's a no-brainer. You'll sell 1 million jerseys, give half the proceeds to COVID relief, and boom, everybody's happy. Trey Boston, I guess he doesn't have the upside of Malik Hooker, but I'm not opposed to it because, again, I think they didn't truly replace Derod Harmon last year, and that cost them. Not necessarily that Jason McCourty and Jonathan Jones and Miles Bryant a bit at the end. Not that they were bad deep safeties, but they weren't great. And you also just lost a corner. It just limited your versatility overall in the defensive backfield. Is he going to come in and replace Devin McCourty? Is he going to come in and be a top 10 free safety in Trey Boston? Probably not. Can he be Derod Harmon? Can he be that second guy that you put on the field in obvious passing situations? Yeah, absolutely. And I think that guy, that second deep safety, is very valuable to a defense that likes to have 3 safeties on the field. So he's another guy. Does he solve the big overarching problems? No. Is he a good guy to have on the roster for 3 or 4 years and be a solid complementary piece? Yes. And I know we're all looking for the answers to the big questions with the Patriots right now and in life, but the answers to the big questions with the Patriots right now, and those are important. But I feel like what a lot of teams do is they look at the answers to the big questions and they fail to figure out the small questions, and you get all these big name pieces in, but you just still kind of can't win at the level you want to win, and it's because you're missing the little things. I'd like to think Bill Belichick and the Patriots are smart enough because they've never had to worry about the big picture really before. But based on everything you hear about Belichick, you'd think that he's not going to let the little things slip away, and you can't let the little things slip away, because when you answer the big questions, you want to hit the ground running. You want to be ready to go. You don't want to have to figure out who your third safety is. So if you get that guy in the building now, doesn't stop you from fixing any of the big problems, and he's still a good player.
One more safety I wanted to throw out there, our guy Murph chiming in here. Tyree Gillespie.
Yeah, I could see that for Murph.
I watched a whole lot of Kyle Pitts tape over the last couple of months. Nobody guarded him better than Tyree Gillespie. And there's something to be said for that, right? I mean, it's not the only thing, but there is something to be said. The only guy that competed down to down with Kyle Pitts was Tyree Gillespie, and everybody else got burned by Kyle Pitts. And I think he gave up one catch for 8 yards in his coverage when he went up against Pitts last year. He also had a really good game against Alabama, had a couple of pass breakups, had one pass breakup on Devonta Smith in coverage. So he's the type of guy that I haven't watched yet really closely, but I've been watching a lot of crossover tape, and I'm like, who's this guy that is basically going toe to toe with Kyle Pitts? That's this guy. So again, another box tight end type of stopper at that position, but he had that tape. He does have that tape. I wanted to answer.
Wait, real quick. The other thing on Gillespie, because the reason I said, of course, it's Murph, because Murph is the big Brandon Bolden guy. Right. Tyree Gillespie is a 4-year starter on special teams in Missouri. I think he was a special teams captain. He's a guy that on day 3 you pick. He's going to be a special teams contributor here for 10 years. You kind of, the safety role comes along, but if they want to replace Nate Ebner is the guy. When I looked at Tyree Gillespie, I thought, all right, if they still feel like they haven't replaced Nate Ebner, Brandon King has been dealing with a ton of injuries the last couple of years. This is the guy for them, Brandon Gillespie on day 3. Oh, we got a Patty Fisher reference too.
I want to turn over to offense quickly, not quarterbacks, but offense.
Sure.
Center. I think this is a really underrated conversation.
It is. I love the Dustin Woodard reference.
Yeah. There are 2, I would say, elite center prospects in this draft in Creed Humphrey and Landon Dickerson. And if the Patriots take either one of those guys with a top 50 pick, everybody's going to moan and groan and be pissed off except me, because I love offensive linemen. But those 2 guys, and there are some other guys that maybe you could get later on in the draft as sort of your Dustin Woodards, your developmental center type of prospects. But those are plug and play centers. And if the Patriots get into a situation where they lose David Andrews in free agency, they need to talk about guys like Creed Humphrey and Landon Dickerson in the building. Both of those guys can really, really play. So I'm fascinated to see how things shake out at that position, because they don't have a future center right now. They don't have anybody on the roster that can take over for David Andrews. If David Andrews, he was only 28. It feels like he's a lot older than that, but he's only 28. So he has a ways to go. But they thought Woodard might be that guy. Obviously, he tapped out. So the question is who's going to play that center in 3 to 4 years, potentially. Again, it's not a need right away for a guy like Creed Humphrey or Dickerson, but those are 2 classic Patriot picks, just, lunch pail type of guys, right? Leaders, lunch pail guys, hard-nosed, tough, dependable, never injured. Well, Dickerson's not injured sometimes, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, center's another position. You want to stay ahead of it. You don't, even though they've had success starting rookies at that position, I mean, that's rare. And keep in mind, too, their last 2 guys, Brian Stork and Andrews, were UDFAs. So as much as we say those are Patriots picks, this is a position, it's like cornerback. They tend to do well without drafting these guys. I will say, you mentioned those guys at the top of the draft. I think Andrews should be back. I do. I think he's their most important free agent. I would consider using the franchise tag on him, frankly, to make sure you get a long-term deal done and keep him in New England. We saw he missed all of 2019, 4 games in 2020. We saw how important he was to the operation. You're probably not going to have Joe Thuney back. He should be back. He is a leader on and off the field of this team. I think it's a huge mistake if he gets away. That being said, they don't, I wasn't wowed by James Ferentz last year. I don't know if you were.
No, James Ferentz is not the answer.
It's a position where you should have a strong backup. Are you using a top 50, 75 pick on that guy? No. Michael Mennett, a tight end out of a center out of Penn State, is a guy I'm looking at on day 3. But I would, if I'm the Patriots, I do everything I can to get David Andrews back, but I still look at a upgraded backup center, whether it's late in the draft, or I trust them to find a center as a UDFA too, just based on their track record.
Andrews was a UDFA, so I definitely trust
and Stork was as well before him, and both were Remington winners. Basically, for years, nobody was drafting the best center in college football, and the Patriots just kept signing them.
Yeah,
and it worked. So I have to look up who won the Remington last year, but maybe that guy, UDFA.
Right, there you go. All right, so let's talk about Brevin Jordan for a second, because Brevin Jordan, I believe it was on a podcast.
Well, Landon Dickerson won the Remington, by the way. He's
okay.
So
he's such
that's off the table this year.
He's such a Patriot. He's not going to take him, but Landon Dickerson checks every single box for them. Okay, Brevin Jordan. He said on a podcast a little while ago that the Patriots have been in contact with him throughout the entire draft process. I threw that out there yesterday. They're doing a lot of homework on both him and Rondell Moore from Purdue, both guys that are very injury-prone players throughout their careers but have fantastic tape. I love the idea of Brevin Jordan because he's, to me, and I think to Bill Belichick too, is a wide receiver just in a tight end's body. So he's just a chess piece. He's just a mismatch waiting to happen, and not necessarily somebody that is a true inline wide tight end. But I think that he could bring a whole lot to this offense in general, just from a matchup standpoint. Great with the ball in his hands too after the catch. Has some Gronk in him after the catch as well. Very, very, very interesting prospect to me.
Yeah, also my bad. Stork was a 4th round pick. I was thinking of somebody else who wasn't drafted. Yeah, again, the whole thing with the tight ends for me is just how young do you want to be at the position, right? And do you want 3 guys who have 5, 6 NFL catches between them coming into the season? And then you can't, if you draft Brevin Jordan and then you add, whether it's a free agent in Gerald Everett or a trade in Zach Ertz, now you have 4 or 5 tight ends on your roster. Like, what are you doing at this point in terms of roster construction? So if they're willing to just cut bait on either of the guys they drafted last year, Ossie, I don't think that's an option. You floated that maybe they understand they screwed up with Dalton Keene. Not as a report, just as a take.
Yeah.
But, then maybe you can talk about it. But again, you're looking at now, that's 3 tight ends on rookie deals. They're probably going to keep Ryan Izzo because they like him. You have Matt LaCosse coming back. You still need to add a real veteran tight end in free agency. Now there's 7 tight ends, I think, on the roster. I've lost count of the tight ends at this point, and now it's a mess. So I don't hate the players. We've talked about this before on and off the air. The issue with this tight end class isn't the players. It's that they took 2 last year in a weak class, and now they have a strong class, and their roster just doesn't support adding another rookie tight end unless they do something drastic that's not going to change. So I think Brevin Jordan's a good player. I think there's a lot of good tight ends in this draft. Again, we talked about it with Jock. Just the context of the pick. How do you justify the pick in terms of the overall roster? It gets very difficult unless you do something extreme at this point. So I'm just outside of Kyle Pitts, who I'm breaking the mold for him. He's a generational talent. He also might be a wide receiver in the eyes of Bill Belichick, which complicates things even more. But outside of Pitts, I just kind of have to be a blanket no on tight ends just based on how the roster's set up. It's nothing against any of them. It's just tricky at this point to justify it.
That's my biggest question. I'm actually going to write about this weekend, is how much does that double dip matter in the context of this offseason, right? How much stock are they putting in the fact that they used 2 third-round picks on tight ends last year? Because this is not a very deep tight end class, but it's a very top-heavy tight end class, right?
No, I think there's some depth there. I've seen that it's not a very deep class. I think for a tight end class, it's deep.
I think the point that I'm trying to make with the depth thing is that those are more Devin Aussies and Dalton Keens. Right.
I get what you're saying.
I know those guys aren't changing anything. They're not better prospects, but I put this out on Twitter, and I'm actually going to, this is final. I have 5 tight ends in this class rated ahead of my first tight end in last year's class, Adam Trotman. Yeah. So you have Kyle Pitts, you have Pat Freiermuth, you have Brevin Jordan, you have Hunter Long, and you have the kid from Notre Dame, Tommy Tremble from Notre Dame.
You still probably could have Miller Forrestall in there, by the way. I think you're sleeping on him.
I know. You like your guy, Miller Forrestall. I know.
I do.
Regardless of all of that, where does that fit in? Because 2 years ago, or was that last year? Last year, Bill Belichick came to the podium after the draft. Somebody asked him, Bill, why didn't you guys take any wide receivers? And he said, well, we took a wide receiver in the first round last year, and then we traded a second-round pick for Mohamed Sanu. So we just kind of felt like we invested a lot in the wide receiver position already, and we weren't going to invest another, hefty pick in a wide receiver. Well, they just drafted 2 guys in the third round at one position last year. Same with the edge rushers, right? It's the same kind of conversation with Uche and Jennings. How much are they going to put in that with those 2 guys and those 4 guys really and say, I don't know, we just did this, let's wait and see how this pans out before we give up on these guys and draft a Brevin Jordan or draft a Pat Fryermuth, who we're then going to have to give, playing time to those guys to develop him. Right. So that's an interesting question. And same with free agency. Are they going to pay Hunter Henry $12 million a year after they just took 2 guys in the top 100?
See, that's where it's different. Free agency, I can see it because you're adding something you don't have, which is experience and NFL success. And on top of that, Ossie and Keen are kind of the perfect second and third tight ends, right? You move them down and suddenly everything makes sense. It's going into the draft and the unknowns that I feel like you're adding an unknown to 2 unknowns. They want stability. What you need at that position is stability. The only way you're getting that is free agency or trading for Zach Ertz or David Njoku or whoever. Yeah. So they can add, like you said, right? They used the first round pick on N'Keal Harry. That's a heavy investment. They traded the second for Mohamed Sanu. That to me is the equivalent of them going out and getting a veteran tight end this year. Like that's what pushes it over the top. I think they do need to add a tight end. I think they know they need to add a tight end. But when it comes down to, do we add via the draft or do we add a veteran? That one should be a no-brainer. You go out and you get somebody who's been playing in the league.
Yeah, they blew this tight end thing. I'm going to say
yes.
I'm going to write about it. Quite frankly, I still can't figure out what the hell they were thinking with trading up for Dalton Keene. If they had just drafted I like Devin Asiasi as a player. I think Devin Asiasi is an NFL player, an NFL tight end. If they had just drafted Asiasi last year, they have this great tight end class and a great free agent tight end class as well, right? There's a lot of guys in free agent. Doesn't usually happen where Hunter Henrys and Jono Smiths and Gerald Everett's and Jared Cooks and all these guys are hitting unrestricted free agency all at once. So you have a lot of talent at tight end that can be acquired this offseason, and they drafted a guy in Dalton Keene who doesn't really have a role in their offense, was well overdrafted. They traded up to draft him in the first place, and there's no role for him. There's no role for him on this team right now, right? There's no role for him unless they're going to move him to fullback. And that one, I think, is really, if they say we're not going to take Brevin Jordan, we're not going to take Hunter Long because we have Dalton Keene on the roster, that's a mistake. That's just a.
But it's not that you have. Well, then they have to cut Dalton Keene, is basically what you're saying.
Or they have to change his role up, and they have him.
But to what?
Fullback.
But he's not a better fullback than Jakob Johnson, and he's not better than Ben Mason.
We don't know that though. We don't know that.
I think we know. I think we saw him block last year. I think we know.
We saw him block on the line of scrimmage and he get pushed around and bullied on the line of scrimmage. But you put him in the backfield and you give him a little bit of a running start, I think things change. And in college, he played more of like an H-back role in that Virginia Tech offense. The Patriots don't have an H-back role really in their offense. It's not really something that they utilize. So Bill Belichick, when they drafted him, they said, yeah, this is a projection. This is a big project that we're taking on with Dalton Keene. And here we are a year in, and I still just don't see the role for him on the team. And they wasted draft capital on him. And now they're in a situation where they're saying, okay, we're not going to draft a Tommy Tremble, who's kind of similar in style, because we drafted Keene last year, even though Tremble is a much better prospect. So I think that they really got stuck there at the tight end spot. And you said it to me the other day when we were texting about it. They overreacted to the fact of how bad their tight ends were in 2019. And they felt like they had to go out there and make some moves at tight end in 2020. If they're willing to admit some of these guys are sunken costs, right? Or just, they messed up on the pick. It didn't work out. That's one thing. But if they double down on those 2 tight ends last year, I think that's going to be a mistake. Third or fourth. I was going to do this one, but what did you do?
Chaz Surratt. We can do this. This is one we can probably do quick.
Yeah.
Actually, no, I either have first round guys or day 3 guys. I actually have no third or actually, Jalen Darden is starting to kind of push the second round. I'll throw Jalen Darden in there. I'll give Jalen Darden as my answer to that question.
Yeah, so I don't know where Amari Rodgers is going to end up going, but he's such a Patriot type of player.
Right.
Really
he's probably below that range, though, right? That'd be high for him. Maybe late 4th.
Yeah, I think maybe he could sneak into the fourth round because he's a really cerebral player, right? You watch him play, and he really understands how to run routes and how to get open in the middle of the field. It's not necessarily a role that they desperately need to fill, but he's the type of guy that I think could really be productive in this system. Sort of Jacoby Myers, but maybe a little bit more athleticism, a little more natural speed. So I really like Amari Rodgers there. Darden's a nice one too. Dimey Brown, more of a speedster. Seth Williams, more of a speedster. Maybe somebody like that is someone that could interest them as well. I'd love to them to get some speed, though.
Right.
And I would love to them invest in a wide receiver before the third round, if we could.
Somebody bring it up. So that's my guy. Dez Fitzpatrick is my guy. He's probably going day 3. I don't think he's going in that range, but give me Dez Fitzpatrick in day 6. Evan can attest this. I am all in on Dez Fitzpatrick.
Yeah, Dez Fitzpatrick's good. Taylor Wallace is another guy that probably going to go earlier than the third round. Maybe he's like a top 75 guy, but you watch Taylor Wallace play and you see Patriots because of his attitude and his sort of alpha dog mentality. He's going to block for you, which that they care about, even though they shouldn't care as much as they do. They do care about it a little bit. He's just a feisty guy, wins vertically, but also can separate with, being able to snap off vertical stems and stuff like that. He's really quick out of his breaks and able to stop on a dime and get out of a break on a vertical stem, which is really useful for a boundary receiver. So maybe somebody like that. Those are some names that we can throw out there as well. Let's see.
We had Chaz Surratt and Patty Fisher questions. I feel like we got to get to those.
Okay. All right.
Because those are two good names to bring up here.
Let's talk about Chaz Surratt for a second. There you go. Go ahead.
You give me the floor. So I had him in my first mock draft on 98.5thesportshub.com going to the Patriots. I saw one of this was the one that mentioned it, the quarterback convert. He originally went in as a left-handed dual threat quarterback. Then they get Sam Howell as a recruit. He was like the top 10 recruit in the country. So Chaz Surratt's like, I want to play in the NFL. I'm not going to play quarterback. Playing here, moves to linebacker. He's still bulking up a little bit, but he's just such a good athlete and his instincts are so good. He's been able to compensate for his lack of technique playing the linebacker position. It showed. He was all first team ACC defense. I think he was the ACC defense. He was the ACC defensive player of the year in 2019. He was the runner up last year. The Patriots have been all over these guys who changed positions either in college or right when they get to college, right? Jacoby Myers was a quarterback. Gunner was a defensive back. Mike Lowen, who's kind of moved around the line. I'm missing, I know, an obvious one. Julian Edelman, right, was a quarterback. Like, they love these guys. There's others, Rashad Berry, J.C. Jackson. They're all over the roster. Chaz Surratt makes a ton of sense for them. He fills a need. He needs to get bigger. But that normally kind of happens naturally when you get a guy in an NFL locker room. The question in an NFL weight room, the question becomes, is he as fast when he puts that weight on? And there's no way to know until that happens. It's not something you could scout. That's just an inherent risk of drafting these kinds of players. But I think Chaz Surratt for them on day 2 checks a ton of boxes, fills needs. He's a middle linebacker. He's been a middle linebacker in college, but he can play on the edge too. He knows how to get after the passer. He knows how to set the edge. And one of the most valuable things about Donta Hightower in New England, right? Go right back to Super Bowl 51, prime example. When you need him to be a downhill run-stopping middle linebacker, he can do that. He can do it well. When you need him to be an edge rusher, he can do that too, and he can do it pretty darn well. So I think Chaz Surratt, he's not quite there right now. He's not going to come in on day 1 and be Donta Hightower. If he was, he'd be a top 10 pick. But he has everything you kind of need. He has other prerequisites to get to that point if he fills in physically and he's coached up correctly. Get him in the building with Belichick, Gerard Mayo, and Donta Hightower for a year or two and get him in that weight room. And I think you could end up with a really talented, very versatile linebacker, a new age, elite athlete linebacker.
That's where you lost Bill Belichick. That's where you lost Bill Belichick.
Where? When I said elite athlete linebacker?
New age.
No, I drafted Jamie Collins. Not quite the same player.
Okay, but Jamie Collins is 255 pounds.
That's true, yeah. Well, Surratt's 220. He should be able to get up into the 240 range.
The question is can he pack it on, right? He's
right.
6'1", maybe 6'2", depending on where you look. 227 is what Draft Network has him listed as. Does he have the frame to pack on more weight? Because that's going to be the question. And last year, I loved Patrick Queen for them at the end of the first round. Thought that he would be the exact type of new age linebacker that they needed. A guy that could really fly to the ball, really athletic. Chaz Surratt's not quite as good of a prospect as Patrick Queen, but it's a similar build and a similar mold. And I just don't know if he fits, right? I don't know if he fits those boxes, but if maybe there is a case for him in the second round, because that's the Patriots typically give up some things that once they get to that point, right? Like, once you get to the second, third, fourth round, okay, maybe this guy doesn't check every single measurables box, but we like all this other stuff about him, right? That type of thing. So I guess I like Chaz Surratt as a player. I think he's going to play in the NFL for a while, but is he a Patriot type of player? I don't know if I see him being exactly what they like.
Again, I'm just hooked on the position change thing in terms of the fit for the Patriots. Like, I think he's a good player regardless, but they've been accumulating those guys. Yeah. And this is right. You have a wide receiver, you have a wide receiver who is a quarterback. You have two wide receivers who's a quarterback. You got all. I think Bill Belichick would see the inherent value in having a linebacker, specifically a middle linebacker, who played a D1 Power 5 college quarterback, especially an option quarterback, where you got to make a ton of reads right at the line of scrimmage. It's not necessarily a reading at the second level. So I don't know. Honestly, maybe what hurts him is he's too good. And maybe because he is an experiment to an extent. He certainly is. But, maybe the Patriots look at him and say, we'd love to take this experiment on as a risk with a 4th round pick, but maybe not a 2nd round pick. Like, maybe he's going too high and that's what's going to kill it. He's too good for them to consider a player like him. But the raw mold, like just some of the boxes he checks in terms of the athleticism, again, the position change, like I think that's right up their alley.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm saying is that if he checks 9 out of 10 boxes, right? Just the measurables box is not checked. So maybe if they can get him in the 2nd round, we're having a different conversation. Our friend Owen here likes to tell us all the names that we're missing here. And we're not missing Rashad Bateman, Owen, I promise.
Right, it's defense week, okay?
It's defense week, and he's also going in the 1st round, and we were asked about 3rd and 4th round wide receivers. So that's why we didn't mention him. Ali McNeil is another player that a lot of people have been on my case to mention as well. I watched him today and finalized his report today. And I like what I see to a degree. I think that there is some concerns that I have with overall athleticism and his role in the NFL. I think he's going to be a 1 down, 2 down player in the league. I don't know how much investment you want to put into a guy like that. Maybe a 3rd or a 4th round pick, somebody like that nowadays. I can see the strength. I can see the 2-gap ability. All those things do exist, but he's not somebody that's going to bring anything to the table at all as a pass rusher in today's NFL. I don't know what more you can really talk about guys like that anymore. How much do you really want to invest in someone like that? I want to wrap up on this. This is not a question that we're getting in the feed, but Tom Pelissero just announced on NFL Network that Adam Humphries has been released by the Tennessee Titans, and we have to talk about it. We have to talk about Adam Humphries coming here to New England. The Patriots were basically signing Adam Humphries a couple of years ago. The Titans, they came in, they upped their offer, then the Patriots tried to up their offer, but he had already verbally committed to Tennessee. It was a little bit too late. That's, again, not a type of player that's really going to move the needle necessarily, but certainly a role type of player. Kind of, I wouldn't call him Julian Edelman. I definitely call him more of a Danny Amendola type, type of upside. But what do we think about Humphries? I know we've talked about him already, but it was a little while ago.
Yeah, I guess I'll just reiterate the conversation we had last week. Is he a good ad? Yes, but, he's a nice 3rd piece, right? Like, who are you putting on top of him? What's the price look like? Can you add, on top of him what you need to add? He's not a slot receiver. He's not. I know why people think he is, but he's not. And he's a guy you're going to play on the outside. He can play pretty physically. And I'm not saying he can't play in the slot, but he's not going to be in that Julian Edelman type role. You mentioned Danny Amendola. I'll even go like Chris Hogan, Malcolm Mitchell, Brandon Lloyd, like fringe. I don't want to throw that one totally out there, but like that kind of guy where you're going to throw him on the sidelines. He's going to be able to use leverage to get open on the exterior, outside the numbers, that sort of guy. They need that guy. He's not the number 1. I think when you're looking to fill that role in the offense, there's probably better options in free agency. Like he wouldn't be my first choice for that role, but if they sign him, there's nothing wrong with that. I think he's more than capable of it.
Yeah. So they really loved him, but I think that you have to kind of think about how things have changed since then, right? Obviously number 12 not being under center changes a whole lot. So do they really love him in their offense today compared to how they loved him a couple years ago when Brady was the quarterback, and it made a whole lot more sense, right? So that's the biggest question, but he definitely plays the way that they like. He's a guy that can separate. He's a guy that's quick, agile, smooth out of his breaks. I think he is going to play mostly in the slot if he did come here. The question is
but he's not going to. So I guess I was probably confusing in that. He's not like an Edelman slot. He's a big slot. He's one of the big slot guys.
Yeah, I would say he's the guy everybody wanted to comp him to was Edelman. When he was in the conversations of coming here, I like to comp him more to like Danny Amendola. I think that's the type of player that he really is. I think the question is with Adam Humphries is certainly what else are you doing, right? Because that is the only move. But second to that is, how do you view Jacoby Myers and N'Keal Harry already on your roster, and where do you plan on playing those guys, if at all, in the future? I think Jacoby.
Does he feel redundant to Jacoby?
A little bit, but I think Jacoby is more of a guy that gets open on a vertical, horizontal plane, if that makes sense, right? Like
I just mean in terms of like when
like
you're, when it comes to week one and they're putting the offensive game plan together, like how, like, can you, what are you doing with both of them? Like, what does, do you get what I'm trying to say? I'm like,
I don't know if both of those, their route trees certainly overlap a little bit, but I think the difference between Humphries and Jacoby Myers is Jacoby Myers really isn't your underneath separate. He's good on slants, goes little slants and stuff like that, but he's not a true option route underneath separator type of receiver. I think Humphries is more that type of guy, and in that vein kind of would fit that Edelman mold a little bit more than a Jacoby Myers mold, right? Is that ability to separate on those short, quick hitting types of routes. The question ultimately, though, is that your offense anymore? Is that the type of offense with whatever quarterback you're running? Is that going to be the way that you're going to operate? I like Humphries' fit in the traditional Patriots scheme, but again, is that going to be the scheme? And who's going to be under center? If they get a guy like Trey Lance or Mac Jones, then I think that it can make some sense. If they're bringing back Cam, I don't see how Adam Humphries helps them at all.
Right. I guess, so what I was trying to say, that helped me think what I was trying to say is, if they're trying to build this more explosive downfield offense.
Definitely not that.
And you're using two of your receiver spots on the field on Adam Humphries and Jacoby Myers, like that's counterproductive, right? You need to have one of those guys. You just do. But if you're trying to be more focused on going down the field and you're, putting 5 roster spots aside for wide receivers, and now you've got Jacoby and you've got Adam Humphries, like you're just kind of limiting what you can do in the context of your own offense.
They were by far the slowest offense in the league last year. It wasn't even close, right? They were the slowest offense in the league last year, and they certainly were the slowest receiving core in the league last year, because they had 2 wide receiver sets where they're throwing N'Keal Harry and Jacoby Myers out on the field at the same time. 2 guys that essentially ran 4.6s, right? We're talking about some real slow NFL receivers, so they got to get faster at that position. I don't know if Adam Humphries, he certainly doesn't help you there. I would much rather see them spend that money, even if it's going to be a couple more dollars, to go get like somebody like a Curtis Samuel, for instance, that can bring some speed and bring that sort of dynamic.
I guess that's what I was trying to say it the nice way, but like, aren't you a little slow if you have those 2 guys as 2 of your top 4 wide receivers?
But if he's your 3rd wide receiver in 11 personnel and he's playing mostly out of the slot, like, I guess you can talk yourself into it, I suppose. But just a player that we have to talk about.
Oh, for sure.
Patriots literally almost signed the guy 2 or 3 years ago. So an important name to watch out for. We are going to be back on the podcast. We appreciate everybody's questions. We're sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but we'll definitely get to them in the future. So keep them running. And we are going to be back on the podcast on Tuesday, probably back to talking about quarterbacks and stuff like that. And we'll take it from there. And then we're kind of we're getting closer to free agency. The door is opening a little bit. And I would say that free agency around the league has already started. Teams are already talking to players. Teams are already talking to agents.
Well, there was a weird report today. I don't know if you saw it. I got to find the exact wording, that like DeMaurice Smith was telling agents to collude with each other or something.
Yeah. Well, so this week would have been the combine. And we all know what happens at the combine, right? The combine is
Right.
really the unofficial start to free agency. So that's where we're at in the NFL calendar. Even though we don't have a combine, you can kind of think of it like that this would technically be combine week. And that's when all the rumors and all this roster movement really starts.
So here's what it was. I mean, I get this. You just made me think of this. This is Tom Pelissero in a virtual meeting today. NFLPA Executive Director DeMaurice Smith implored agents for free agents at the same position to collude and increase leverage in contract talks, given the drop in salary cap. That doesn't feel, I guess it is allowed, but like that, I don't know. That feels weird.
Yeah, it all does feel weird, but we're getting into the heat of the offseason free agency. Once free agency gets underway a little bit, I think we're going to really find out the direction of this team. And then really be able to hammer home some of the draft stuff after that, after the first week or so of free agency. So we'll be back on the podcast on Tuesday talking all things Patriots, all these scenarios, all these questions that you guys have been asking. I'm sure we'll hit on a bunch of it as well. And then we'll be back right here, same time, same place on Thursday for the Q&A. And we'll take you throughout the entire offseason in that format. So stick it here for the Q&A next Thursday. Podcast Patriots Beat on all your podcast channels, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, whatever it is that you use. And Alex and I will be back next week for the live Q&A. Thanks everybody for watching.